My name is María Bargh. I'm a senior lecturer and head of school in the School of Māori Studies, Victoria University.
And you are Maori?
And I'm Maori. Yep, I'm from Te Arawa and Ngāti Awa, which are two tribes in the Bay of Plenty.
So there is a lot of interest in Chile about the New Zealand case of the negotiation between the Crown and the Maori people. Tell me a little bit about the background first, the historical background of the key moments of the Maori history.
Well, I guess we really need to go back to the 1820s, when sort of huge or more significant numbers of settlers were coming to New Zealand. And there were kind of cooperative relations at that time, but the British settlers had a desire for more land, and that soon led to some tensions. But on the Maori side, Maori were producing a range of crops, wheat, potatoes, other produce, and were selling those into Auckland, but were also keen to export. So Māori were also partnering with some non-Māori who'd come to the country to build schooners, to build vessels large enough to export to Australia. And so in the 1830s, there were a couple of vessels that were in fact confiscated by the authorities in Australia because they were trying to enter those ports but didn't have a flag, a state flag attached. So Māori, particularly in the north of the country, were very keen to have a flag to be able to continue exporting. So the 1835 Declaration of Independence was in part about trade.
Of the Maori.
Of the Maori. So in that declaration, Māori said, we declare ourselves independent and only we may have a government in this country. That particular declaration was recognised by King William IV in England.
Okay, the Crown.
By the Crown.
And after that, what happened? It was a process of colonization?
So shortly after that, tensions began to rise between settlers and their desire for bigger areas of land and Māori seeing the kind of influx of people. And so the British sent a captain, William Hobson, to sort of sort things out, and his instructions were also to acquire, the parts of New Zealand that could be acquired for the British. But the Treaty of Waitangi was the broader result between Māori and the Crown, the British Crown, and in that particular agreement, Māori retained sovereignty, and the British were granted the ability to govern. And so there were two versions of this treaty, and people still argue about those two versions. One of the versions was in the Māori language and was not drafted by Māori people. The other version was in English and drafted by the British. As you might expect, in the English language version, Māori cede sovereignty to the British Crown. In the Māori language version, Māori retain sovereignty. Most, 99% of all the chiefs signed the Māori language version. So we know under international law, the contra preferentum rule, that those who didn't draft that treaty, and if it's in your native language, that's the version that's taken as the correct version in cases of dispute.
Okay, and then the New Zealand became independent. When was that?
So there were sort of different stages of becoming a colony, becoming a dominion, becoming a realm, and becoming independent. We had a bit of parliament was set up shortly after 1840, so 1852. We have our Constitution Act, and that's seen as one of our kind of founding steps. But all through the 1850s and 1860s, these different understandings about what had been guaranteed in the Treaty of Waitangi became very apparent, and we had land wars through the 1860s, 1850s, 1860s.
Okay, and at some point you get to the 20th century, and what happened there?
Yeah, so during the land wars, land was confiscated, but Māori in many places still retained stayed in their tribal areas. But as times changed...
Did the Maori fight back? Or?
Yes, Māori fought. It was a war.
A war, okay.
Yeah, it was a war. But eventually things changed. Some Māori moved into cities, and there was a new era. Some people promoted assimilation and so on. If you jump forward to the 1970s or 1960s, There were a number of Maori activists that were inspired by the civil rights movement in the US, and those kinds of issues being raised, and were trying to champion treaty rights, Maori rights. And so that led to Maori politicians trying to push for the Treaty of Waitangi to have greater recognition, because it had been lost for many years.
And what happened with that movement? In which term did you get like the Waitangi Tribunal?
Yeah, so in 1975, the Treaty of Waitangi Act was passed, and that established the Waitangi Tribunal, and that was really a landmark kind of point in our history. The Waitangi Tribunal hears claims brought by any Māori person relating to breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi. And so they conduct research into the matter, and Māori conduct their own research, the Crown conducts its research, so they're fairly robust reports that are produced. Unfortunately, the Waitangi Tribunal only has the powers of recommendation, so they then make recommendations to the government, and the government can decide if they accept those or not.
And who was integrating this Waitangi Tribunal? Like only New Zealand people or Maori people? It was a mix. Like who was the Waitangi Tribunal?
So there are a range of different experts that sit on the tribunal. Some are there for their Māori language and cultural knowledge and history, but there are also former politicians. So there are a mix of Māori and non-Māori, lawyers and non-lawyers.
Okay. Did you get like legitimacy that tribunal?
Yes, I mean, I think for many Māori people, having an apology or having the history aired, being able to have your say about the version of events is really important. So I think it's been a good process for many Māori. The outcomes are not always, given they're just recommendations, the government doesn't always take them into account. That's a bit of a dilemma. But separate to that process, we also have another process which really got started as a product of the delays in the Waitangi Tribunal process. For many people, it was taking 20 years to have their cases heard. So separate from that, the government set up a direct settlement process where they have a team of negotiators. They engage with the Maori tribe and negotiate over what happened.
How many tribes? Like
There's around 20 to 30, depending of different sizes.
So direct negotiation between the government and these tribes on what? On land?
On breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi.
Okay.
Yeah. So most of those are historical, and so we've seen the return of land, some land that's not been owned by the Crown, and some financial redress as well. But those packages are still only a tiny percentage of what was actually taken in the first place.
Tiny, like less than 10%?
1%, less than 10%.
Wow. And now the situation of the Maori, do you have like, first, what is the situation of land within the Maori? Do you have collective land? You have individual land? What is the situation?
So we have different land titles, but we also have a particular land title called Māori Land, which is governed by the Māori Land Act, and there are particular kinds of governance entities that manage that land, and that is communally held. And so that continues to exist, and so that's one title of land. But we also have general land, Māori owning general land titles.
Tell me a little bit about the institutional mechanism of political representation of the Maori and within the New Zealand government as well.
So if we go back to the 1860s, so at that time there were these different understandings about what the Treaty of Waitangi had guaranteed. Māori were trying to hold the Crown to account. They were writing submissions, making petitions, going to England to try and see the king or the queen at those different times to say, hey, we thought we had a treaty, we thought our rights were going to be upheld. That doesn't seem to be happening. You know, what are we going to do? So Māori set up the King movement to replicate, in some ways, the monarchy back in England, so that the British could see that there was a political structure and set of institutions that they should be engaging with. They also set up a Māori parliament, which had ministers and select committees and all these sorts of things to try and pass legislation and to try and demonstrate that we continue to hold our sovereignty. But the
you did
Crown,
it by yourself. I mean,
Māori did it by themselves.
Okay.
Yep. Got together across tribes, which is quite significant because some of those had serious, tensions between them, and that was an attempt to try and, maintain our own sovereignty.
Okay.
But the Crown tended to ignore that, except in 1867. Part of the reason they set up the Māori seats, the Māori electorates, in 1867 was to try and draw and assimilate some of that expression of Māori sovereignty into the new settler parliament. That was one of the reasons.
Okay.
So at that time, 4 seats were established, and they were meant to be temporary because the assumption of the day was that Māori people would assimilate and not need separate representation.
Okay.
But they were extended, and now we have 7 Māori seats in a parliament of 120.
Okay. And tell me a little bit about the current situation of the Maori people. What are the main issues that you are handling? Because I think that it's not like settled, all the situation between the government and the Maori, no?
Yeah. Well, we have, on the one hand, we do have these 7 seats for representation, and we have a greater recognition of Māori rights and treaty rights. But at the same time, we have a government, we have the Crown, which is essentially recidivist. It continues to breach the Treaty of Waitangi over and over and over again. And we can see that in all sorts of very recent events.
Like what?
So, for example, around kind of mining operations that we have, around questions of water ownership, around the negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, doesn't uphold Māori rights. The Crown has the right to govern, but they need to be actively protecting Māori rights at the same time. And since Māori were never involved in the negotiations of that particular agreement, or in fact any free trade agreements, we can see that those rights aren't being properly upheld.